Welcome to the history of Flora's art. This audio guide will introduce you to 6 of the exhibition's highlights, as well as its main story. Press pause and then play when you are ready to move on to the next item. Introduction. Throughout history, plants have been valued as food, medicine, or industrial material, or simply because of their beauty. Books of plants, or flora, reflect such concerns. Some books depict plants primarily for correct determination, such as to allow doctors to prepare the right medicine. Others display flowers in their full glory, in lavish coffee table books to show off to your friends. The exhibition shows how the representation of plants in these books depends not just on skill, but also on evolving printing techniques and practical concerns. What is a good representation of a plant depends also on what the representation is for. In these books, a plant is never just a plant. You might want to press pause before we move on to item number 4, a Renaissance herbal Dodoen's Kruidboek. Item number 4, a Renaissance herbal Dodoen's Kruidboek. In Europe, botanical work really took off during the Renaissance, as new plants were arriving from all over the world as a result of global exploration and colonial expansion. Systematizing and identifying plants became increasingly difficult, but also vital for medicinal and economic applications. Plant books called herbals provided this valuable knowledge. On display is a replica of the Kruidboek by the Flemish medical doctor and botanist Rembert Dodoens, or at least the Latin translation to be precise. Right into the 19th century, botany was taught to and by doctors as part of their professional skills to prepare medication. Dodoens also was a doctor and a star author for the Plantain printer in Antwerp and later in Leiden, and the book went through many reeditions. The plants are depicted using intricately carved wood blocks. The skill of making these had developed so much that the figures could actually support plant determination. Compare this with the crude images on the shelf above that were just decorative extras. The carved wood blocks were so valuable that they would be traded between printers throughout Europe. Expensive copies of the book would be colored in by hand. At the Plantain Museum in Antwerp, you can admire some of the originals. We'll move on to Linnaeus, item number 6. Pause and then press play again when you are ready. Item number 6. Carl Linnaeus. The Swedish doctor and botanist Carl Linnaeus was the great systematizer of the 18th century. More than any of his contemporaries, he attempted to create an encompassing classification of the entire natural world. The foundations for his system were actually made in the Netherlands, as he tried to create order in the enormous botanical collection of a rich banker. In spite of his enormous importance for taxonomy, Linnaeus actually does not really deserve a place in an exhibition about botanical art. He thought proper scientific descriptions should be based on precise Latin terminology rather than figures. However, botanical illustrators quickly came to the rescue. The page in the back demonstrates how to recognize the typical configurations of stamen in flowers that Linnaeus used to divide plants in 24 main classes. For this purpose, the depiction of the complete plant was not necessary, only the features that a botanist had to recognize for the purpose of determination. In the re-edition of the Flora Batava below on the next shelf, you can see the references to the Linnaean classes and orders of plants underneath the plant names. But we will turn to the splendor of 18th century coffee table books next, at number 9 with Maria Sibylla Merian. Press pause and play when you are ready to move on. Item number 9, Maria Sibylla Merian. The story of Miriam is inspiring and wonderful. Fleeing an unhappy marriage in Germany, artist Miriam ended up in the Netherlands. In 1699, she traveled to Suriname with one of her daughters for a tropical expedition. Her main interest was in the metamorphosis of insects, but she displayed the insects on their host plants. In this sense, she not only brought new insights into the life of insects, but could also be considered a forerunner of ecology. With this perspective, not just the plant needs to be depicted, and definitely not just parts of the flowers, as with Linnaeus, but plants together with the insects that lived on them. But Miriam's drawings of Suriname flowers are much more than just biological explorations. She also produced gorgeous artworks, highly appreciated by the wealthy contemporaries who bought her books. After returning from a hair-raising voyage, she set up her own print shop in Amsterdam with her daughters. The Book of Suriname Insects used the latest copper engraving techniques that provided unrivaled detail. For the wealthiest customers, she and her daughters would hand-color the folio-sized books. Rich Amsterdam patricians used them to dazzle their visitors. Showing off knowledge of the latest scientific discoveries was all the rage in the 18th century upper classes, and these books displayed both knowledge and wealth. You could really dazzle your visitors. Please press pause before moving on to the second display cabinet to your right. Press play when you got to number 16, the ecological perspective. Number 16, the ecological perspective. For herbals, the depiction of individual plants was important. For Linnaean taxonomy, details of flowers. For Miriam, plants in interaction with insects. But why should we depict just individual plants or their parts? From an ecological perspective, it can be much more revealing to represent plants in their natural environments among the other plants that belong to the same community. This same perspective also inspired the botanical garden in the Brakkestein Park. Traditional botanical gardens organized plants along a taxonomic system, focused on teaching people how to recognize plants or how to reproduce and distribute useful crops. Just like the Nederlandse ecologische Flora, the Nijmegen Botanical Garden organizes plants from a community ecology perspective. It was inspired by the work of plant ecologist and conservationist Victor Westhoff, who was professor at Nijmegen from 1967 to 1981. Just like our botanical garden, the ecological field guide here displayed highlights the community rather than the individual plant. Press pause until you find number 17 with the mystical plants and the Flora Diabolica on the top shelf. Number 17. The Flora Diabolica. The Flora Diabolica describes stories of magical properties ascribed to plants in the Low Countries, many of which involve warding off or appealing to the devil. Rather than to focus on the biological relevance of plants, this book relates plants to cultural meanings and connotations. There are similar books on this shelf about plants mentioned in the Bible, also for their cultural and spiritual significance. Once you move beyond the purely biological perspective, cultural connotations become relevant for how plants are depicted. Throughout the history of art, you see plants appearing with cultural significance. Think of the rose as a symbol of love, or the lily as a symbol of purity, or the thistle as Scotland's national emblem. In fact, the representation that isolates a purely biological perspective from cultural meanings only differentiated towards the mid-17th century. But even in popular field guides today, you might come across bits of folklore that liven up biological descriptions. Press pause until you've found out the field guides below with number 22, HH&T or Heijmans, Heinsius and Thijssen. Number 22, HH&T, which stands for Heijmans, Heinsius and Thijssen. Throughout the entire 20th century, this dry but efficient field guide, with its peculiar and handy format, would be used by plant enthusiasts throughout the Dutch-speaking Low Countries. The first edition appeared in 1899 and the 23rd and last in 1994. Its first authors were teachers and among the founders of the nature conservation movement in the Netherlands. Their books were to encourage knowledge of nature among the general population as a way to convey the value of nature protection. The plant illustrations in these guides remained black and white line drawings. This kept the cost down, but the makers also believed that color could be misleading, as plant color can vary. Instead, the drawings highlight and stylize characteristic botanical features that support determination. For all their botanical accuracy, these figures do not represent plants as they really are, but the features of plants that are of particular taxonomical relevance. You can pause once again before we reach the bottom shelf with the future of field guides and the conclusion. 25. The future of field guides. Printed field guides now face the competition of information packaged in apps. Maybe you've come across Ops-Identify, an app that recognizes plants and other species from pictures you make with your mobile phone. We have provided a link with a QR in the exhibit if that sounds interesting to you. But even in these apps, the visual representation of plants lives on. Photography now attempts to capture plants from their best angle, still focusing on what seems like the optimal representation to recognize plants. The AI behind the apps may be paying attention to features that are hard to recognize for us. It too has its own perspective. And so, Flora's art is not dead, it just keeps transforming. Middenvlug and I, Willem Halfman, hope you've enjoyed our little story and the wondrous plant box that we discovered in our library's collection. Thank you for visiting.